on any given issue, you could be either prosecutor or defense. So, like this one case, he could be with the government. Next case, he could be with, helping defend somebody that's been accused. So, again, I'm not sure if that's the way that it works, but those movies, that movie and the show Jag was, there was definitely some things that were true, and there are definitely some things that were accurate. There's definitely some things that were Hollywood, but the fact that Tom Cruise and A Few Good Men was getting assigned to that murder case, and the reason why, that was pretty sensational. I don't know that they would ever give that kind of a case to somebody that junior, but it's possible. And certainly in my first year, my first year as a prosecutor, we had a case which was an unfortunate incident where a mother was being accused of recklessness, where her daughter fell off the back of the car and hit her head and died. There was no intention there whatsoever. But this is one of my first cases that I was affiliated with. And so, yeah, that was true. But yeah, my mom loves the show Jag, and I've never seen the other one you said, The Code.
The Code. It was on CB. It was only one season, not well received.
Okay.
A lot of veterans had issues with the Marine uniforms because they were way off, the haircuts were off.
Yeah, it always sort of drives me crazy when they have these shows and they can't do the simple things like that, or just salute. I mean, like, how hard is it to teach somebody to salute, like, not horribly?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bunch of different salutes. You have, different personalities, but, I watched this show, the SEAL Team, the one with David Boreanaz. I think that's really good. But they do little things like that where they get it right, where they, and another great one was Band of Brothers on HBO back in the day. And, that one was probably the most accurate with regard to, I think, how officers and enlisted guys get along or interact with each other. That was the most authentic military show I've ever seen.
We were wondering if you could take us sort of step by step through how a criminal case unfolds under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and how that's different from how a case goes in the civilian justice system.
Well, the biggest factor is the commander, is the commanding officer or the convening authority. The ability to move a case forward and also seal a case once it's finished begins and ends with the commander, where in the civilian world, obviously, that doesn't happen. We have, in the civilian world, you'd have an allegation or a complaint, and then you'd have a grand jury potentially to see if you have enough evidence to move forward, and then the person would be arraigned and charged. And then once sentencing comes down, that's usually it, unless there's an appeal based on the law that goes up through the court system. In the military justice system, obviously, we have not only the criminal aspects of UCMJ, but also the non-judicial punishment stuff like Article 15s, which are spearheaded, by potentially a commanding officer, along with the advice and consent of his judge advocate. That's what the JAG's there for, is to advise the commander. There's a lot of things that they can do in the military that wouldn't be crimes, obviously, in the civilian world. That, you're not taking somebody's liberty away and putting them in jail, but you're making them do like extra duty or, confined to barracks or whatever, Article 15 punishment the commander wants to do. So in that respect, it's almost like the commander is this sort of super judicial being on above everything. So the biggest thing that I can say is when they prefer charges and they go forward with the case, and then there's a court martial, and then there's a sentencing, the commanding officer has to sign off on that sentencing. Now, if, there is some protections there that, like, if somebody is found, not guilty, the commanding officer has to live with that. But if they're found guilty and the punishment is a certain level and the commanding officer doesn't like it, that it can be amended. So those are things that are sort of unique to the criminal justice system, or to the military justice system, as opposed to the criminal justice system. I think that it's extremely fair, and there's a lot of things where if you talk to judge advocates that know what they're doing, would say that there's actually more protections in a court-martial system than there is in civilian court as far as, rights of a defendant. And making sure that we get what we're doing right.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of people that allege that presence of the commander gives a lot of opportunity for intervention and bias in a case, sort of like railroading people.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. Unlawful command influence is the biggest obstacle that we have in the military. When we're in the JAG school in Charlottesville, unlawful command influence is a huge topic. That a commanding officer, even though they're an integral part of the wheel that's moving the UCMJ forward, that they have to be careful that it doesn't cross over into the line of them basically having a role in guilt or innocence or prejudicing the process in any way, shape, or form. So, and I think commanding officers have gotten a lot better at being careful not to do anything that's, going to come back and hurt them or haunt them later. When I was in Congress, I used to probably see more than my fair share of military officers or commanders that would come see me being like, hey, I was supposed to get promoted and I'm like not on the list because I think of this thing that, was alleged that there was unlawful command influence in this case or something like that. And this is the opposite of being, intervening. This is like his superiors worrying about that he exerted too much influence so there was definitely a sense, especially when I was in Congress, that people were being ultra careful about what they were doing, how things were being perceived to the civilian world, that the military justice system wasn't just a bunch of yahoos going out there and throwing people in jail just because they didn't think that they were good soldiers, sort of like the Nathan Jessup standard. But even though, a lot of people in this country love what he said on the stand, and then you sort of, in a way, there's these pardons that happened recently that, some people agree with.
So on that note of presidential pardons, we're seeing this a lot in the news lately with the case of First Lieutenant Clint Lawrence, who ordered his men to shoot unarmed Afghan motorcyclists. Ultimately, he was convicted on the testimony of 9 members of his platoon. We also have the case of Army Major Matt Goldstein, who ambushed an unarmed Afghan civilian who was allegedly a Taliban bomb maker. Initially, he said that another soldier in his platoon did it, but then in a Fox News interview, he said that he was the one who did it. So the Army was set to review the case this December, but the president put a block on that. And then we have the case of Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, who was acquitted of murdering an ISIS detainee who was receiving medical attention, but was convicted of posing for a photo with the dead body. So you have the president pardoning these alleged war criminals, or at least getting involved in the military justice process. Trump tweeted recently that we train our boys to be killing machines, then prosecute them when they kill. And that echoes a sentiment he also expressed in 2016 when he said that you have to play the game the way they're playing the game, the way that our enemies are playing the game. I'm curious, what do you think of the president's line of thinking? Do you agree with it?
No, especially that last part. We follow the rules of engagement and we live by a set standard based on, whether it be Geneva Convention standards or historic laws of war. We don't fight in violation of those things because we're the United States of America. One of the hardest things about fighting the global war on terror is that unlike traditional warfare where you have two sides lining up against each other, both wearing their respective uniforms, holding their flag of their side, where you can see a discernible enemy across a battlefield, we don't have that anymore. We wear the uniform and the other side generally doesn't. The other side generally ebbs and flows in and out of sort of like, civilian status versus combatant status. And it's really hard to determine who they are and whether or not they're a threat, those type of things. So, in that regard, the enemy that our fighting men and women are facing today is the hardest enemy to see, literally, I think, in any time in military combat. And they use that to their advantage. They know that we're going to fight by the rules, and they're using the fact that we fight by the rules against us. But to say in any way that we need to start fighting dirty too, I think goes against who we are as Americans and why we're respected the world over and why we have such reverence for our war fighters. Now, with these three cases, let me say this. I think it is completely appropriate for the commander-in-chief to pardon or commute sentences if he thinks that there was some kind of unfair action or something, or even if he feels for whatever reason it's fully within his prerogative to do what he has done. What I didn't like, and some of my colleagues had used some of this language over the last few years with some of these, in relation to some of these cases, without going too much into the specifics of the cases, people started talking about the JAG Corps in the military as sort of the bad guy, and that the military justice system was somehow tainted or corrupt or overzealous because we just feel like doing that. That is completely not true. The people that I served with in the JAG Corps were Democrats, they were Republicans, they were liberals, they were conservatives, but they all had a job to do. Now, don't get me wrong. There was some one or two or three or four, however many you meet in any kind of occupation where you're like, that guy's a jerk. I would never want him as my attorney, or I would never want him, working on behalf of the government because I don't trust him. You'll get that in any job. But by and large, the people that were in the JAG Corps were good, honest, hardworking lawyers trying to represent soldiers or represent victims in the government and uphold a certain standard that we should all be proud of. At some point, it became cliche to start saying that the JAG Corps and the military justice system was, corrupt. And I'm trying to think of a better word than corrupt, but that's sort of how I took it. And I'm just like, really? Are we really starting to, use the whole, and this is what politics has become in large part. It's like, if you don't say something, blow the whole system up, And so bad-mouthing the military justice system became in vogue recently with members of Congress, friends of mine, and it drove me crazy. But in these three cases specifically, I think that I understand both sides. I understand that, we have to engage enemy combatants as we take them. And sometimes it's hard for, like, the lieutenant to discern whether or not that guy is a lawful enemy combatant at the time he's on the motorcycle and maybe not engaged at that point, but knowing that he historically has been engaged, is he a lawful target? In historical terms, would he be somebody that, could have been fired upon in World War II or the Civil War or whatever you want to, use, and versus what the standards were then? And a lot of that is determined by the commander-in-chief and the Congress when you're talking about rules of engagement. The rules of engagement, I think, under President Obama were a little tougher for soldiers to operate under, but we were trying to maybe have a higher standard of responsibility or what have you. I think they've been relaxed a little bit. I'm not going to get into the debate of what's better, but I understand. I can see what happened, and I can see why that there was testimony for and against this lieutenant. I can also see his parents thinking that, he was over there in a foreign country in a really hot situation. He saw a bad guy and he had him taken out. Whether or not that situation was right or wrong or what the standard should be is really, really hard for me to defend or prosecute. I know I'm sounding like a politician right now, taking both sides, but on paper, he wasn't a combatant at that time. And so, by rule, maybe the conviction was right, but if he was my son, and, I can also see the other side of light that guy up, so it's really hard. And it's hard because they make it hard by acting that way. And I can see the frustration. Like, why should we have to play by the rules when they don't? Which is what the president was tweeting. With regard to the SEAL posing in front of he's not allowed to do that. That's against the UCMJ and it's against the law. So he shouldn't have done that. He should have known he shouldn't have done that. I know that there's definitely a different standard with I've been reading